The American Enlightenment is a period of intellectual ferment in the 13 American colonies in the period 1714 to 1818, which led to the American Revolution, and the creation of the American Republic, influenced by the 18th-century European Enlightenment and its own native American philosophy. The American Enlightenment applied scientific reasoning to politics, science, and religion, promoted religious tolerance, and restored literature, the arts, and music as important disciplines and professions worthy of study in colleges. The new model, American-style colleges of King's College, New York, and the College of Philadelphia were founded. Yale College and the College of William and Mary were reformed, and a non-denominational moral philosophy replaced theology in many college curricula. Even Puritan colleges such as the College of New Jersey and Harvard University reformed the curricula to include natural philosophy, modern astronomy, and mathematics. Among the foremost representatives of the American Enlightenment were presidents of colleges, including Puritan religious leaders Jonathan Edwards, Thomas Clapp, and Ezra Stiles, and Anglican moral philosophers Samuel Johnson and William Smith. The leading political thinkers were John Adams, James Madison, George Mason, James Wilson, and Alexander Hamilton, and polymaths Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Leading scientists included Benjamin Franklin for his work on electricity, William Smith for his organization and observations of the transit of Venus, Jared Elliott for his work in metallurgy and agriculture, the astronomer David Rittenhouse in astronomy, math, and instruments, Benjamin Rush in medical science, Charles Wilson Peale in natural history, and Cadwallader Colden for his work in botany and town sanitation. Colden's daughter, Jane Colden, was the first female botanist working in America. Count Rumford was a leading scientist, especially in the field of heat. Terminology. The term American Enlightenment was coined in the post-World War II era. It was not used in the 18th century, when English speakers commonly referred to a process of becoming enlightened. Dates. Various dates for the American Enlightenment have been proposed, including the dates 1750 to 1820, 1765 to 1815, and 1688 to 1815. One somewhat more precise start date proposed is the introduction of a collection of donated Enlightenment books by colonial agent Jeremiah Dummer into the library of the small college of Yale at Saybrook Point, Connecticut on or just after October 15, 1714. They were received by a young postgraduate student, Samuel Johnson, of Guilford, Connecticut, who studied the Enlightenment works. Finding they contradicted all his hard-learned Puritan learning, he wrote, using the metaphors of light that would soon be used to characterize the age, that all this was like a flood of day to his low state of mind, and that he found himself like one at once emerging out of the glimmer of twilight into the full sunshine of open day. Quote, 2 years later, in 1716, as a Yale tutor, Johnson introduced a new curriculum into Yale using the donated Dummer books, offering what Johnson called the New Learning, which included the works and ideas of Francis Bacon, John Locke, Isaac Newton, Boyle, Copernicus, and literary works by Shakespeare, Milton, and Addison. Joseph Ellis has traced the impact of the newly introduced Enlightenment ideas on the Yale commencement thesis of 1718. Religious tolerance. Enlightened founding fathers, especially Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington, fought for and eventually attained religious freedom for minority denominations. According to the Founding Fathers, the United States should be a country where peoples of all faiths could live in peace and mutual benefit. James Madison summed up this ideal in 1792, saying, "Consciences as the most sacred of all property. A switch away from established religion to religious tolerance was one of the distinguishing features of the era from 1775 to 1818. The passage of the new Connecticut Constitution on October 5, 1818, overturned the 180-year-old Standing Order under the Connecticut Charter of 1662, whose provisions dated back to the founding of the state in 1638 and the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. It has been proposed as a date for the triumph, if not the end, of the American Enlightenment. The new Constitution guaranteed freedom of religion and disestablished the Congregational Church. Intellectual currents. Between 1714 and 1818 a great intellectual change took place that changed the British colonies of America from a distant backwater into a leader in the fields of moral philosophy, educational reform, religious revival, industrial technology, science, and, most notably, political philosophy. It saw a consensus on a pursuit of happiness-based political philosophy. Architecture. After 1780, the federal style of American architecture began to diverge from the Georgian style and became a uniquely American genre. In 1813, the American architect Ezra Stiles designed and in 1814 to 1816 built the first Gothic-style church in North America, Trinity Church on the Green in New Haven, predating the English Gothic revival by a decade. In the fields of literature, poetry, music and drama, some latent artistic attempts were made, particularly in pre-war Philadelphia, but American culture in these fields was largely imitative of British culture for most of the period, and is generally considered not very distinguished. Republicanism. Politically, the age is distinguished by an emphasis upon economic liberty, republicanism and religious tolerance, as clearly expressed in the United States Declaration of Independence. Attempts to reconcile science and religion resulted in a rejection of prophecy, miracle, and revealed religion, resulting in an inclination toward deism among some major political leaders of the age. American republicanism emphasized consent of the government, riddance of aristocracy, and fear of corruption. It represented the convergence of classical republicanism and English republicanism. J.G.A. Pocock explained the intellectual sources in America, liberalism and republicanism. Since the 1960s, historians have debated the Enlightenment's role in the American Revolution. Before 1960, the consensus was that liberalism, especially that of John Locke, was paramount. Republicanism was largely ignored. The new interpretations were pioneered by J.G.A. Pocock, who argued in the Machiavellian moment that, at least in the early 18th century, Republican ideas were just as important as liberal ones. Pocock's view was now widely accepted. Bernard Bailyn and Gordon Wood pioneered the argument that the founding fathers of the United States were more influenced by republicanism than they were by liberalism. Cornell University professor Isaac Kramnik, on the other hand, argues that Americans have always been highly individualistic and therefore lock-in. In the decades before the American Revolution, the intellectual and political leaders of the colonies studied history intently, looking for guides and models for good government. They especially followed the development of Republican ideas in England. Pocock explained the intellectual sources in the United States. The Whig canon and the Neo-Harringtonians, John Milton, James Harrington and Sidney Trenchard Gordon and Bolingbroke, together with the Greek, Roman, and Renaissance masters of the tradition as far as Montesquieu, formed the authoritative literature of this culture, and its values and concepts were those with which we have grown familiar. A civic and patriot idea ideal in which the personality was founded in property, perfected in citizenship but perpetually threatened by corruption, government figuring paradoxically as the principal source of corruption and operating through such means as patronage, faction, standing armies, established churches and the promotion of a moneyed interest, though the formulation of this last concept was somewhat hindered by the keen desire for readily available paper credit common in colonies of settlement. And neoclassical politics provided both the ethos of the elites and the rhetoric of the upwardly mobile, and accounts for the singular cultural and intellectual homogeneity of the Founding Fathers and the generation. The commitment of most Americans to these Republican values made inevitable the American Revolution. Britain was increasingly seen as corrupt and hostile to Republicanism, and a threat to the established liberties the Americans enjoyed. Leopold von Ranke, a leading German historian, in 1848 claims that American republicanism played a crucial role in the development of European liberalism, by abandoning English constitutionalism and creating a new republic based on the rights of the individual. The North Americans introduced a new force in the world. Ideas spread most rapidly when they have found adequate concrete expression. Thus republicanism entered a Romanic, Germanic world. Up to this point, the conviction had prevailed in Europe that monarchy best served the interests of the nation. Now the idea spread that the nation should govern itself, but only after a state had actually been formed. On the basis of the theory of representation did the full significance of this idea become clear. All later revolutionary movements have this same goal. This was the complete reversal of a principle. Until then, a king who ruled by the grace of God had been the center around which everything turned. Now the idea emerged that power should come from below. These two principles are like two opposite poles, and it is the conflict between them that determines the course of the modern world. In Europe, the conflict between them had not yet taken on concrete form. With the French Revolution it did. Life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Many historians find that the origin of this famous phrase derives from Locke's position that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. Others suggest that Jefferson took the phrase from Sir William Blackstone's Commentaries on the Laws of England. Others note that William Wollaston's 1722 book The Religion of Nature Delineated describes the truest definition of natural religion as being the pursuit of happiness by the practices of reason and truth. The Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was written by George Mason and adopted by the Virginia Convention of Delegates on June 12, 1776, a few days before Jefferson's draft, in part reads, that all men are by nature equally free and independent, and have certain inherent rights, of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest the posterity, namely, the enjoyment of life and liberty, with the means of acquiring and possessing property, and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. The United States Declaration of Independence, which was primarily written by Jefferson, was adopted by the Second Continental Congress on July 4, 1776. The text of the second section of the Declaration of Independence reads, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty and the pursuit of happiness." Deism. Both the moderate Enlightenment and a radical or revolutionary Enlightenment were reactions against the authoritarianism or irrationality and obscurantism obscurantism of the established churches. Philosophers such as Voltaire depicted organized Christianity as a tool of tyrants and oppressors and as being used to defend monarchism. It was seen as hostile to the development of reason and the progress of science and incapable of verification. An alternative religion was deism, the philosophical belief in a deity based on reason rather than religious revelation, a dogma. It was a popular perception among the philosophers, who adopted deistic attitudes to varying degrees. Deism greatly influenced the thought of intellectuals and founding fathers, including John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, perhaps George Washington, and especially Thomas Jefferson. The most articulate exponent was Thomas Paine, whose The Age of Reason was written in France in the early 1790s and soon reached the United States. Paine was highly controversial when Jefferson was attacked for his deism in the 1800 election. Democratic-Republican politicians took pains to distance the candidate from Paine. Unitarianism and deism were strongly connected, the former being brought to America by Joseph Priestley, the oxygen scientist. Dr. Samuel Johnson called Lord Edward Herbert the father of English deism.